Thank you all again for hosting me for a second time, and my apologies also for the previous speakers because I could only attend the first two talks yesterday, that of Chiara and Hongyu Wong. Sorry, I don't have internet, so I would say a big thanks to Andrea for hosting me and giving me the opportunity to talk today. So, regarding the title of this presentation, I think the title says it all, a mechanistic framework for the neural correlates of conscious visual object perception. Let me introduce to you the topic before I spell out a little bit the structure of this presentation. So, one of the big questions, of course, of the search for an explanation of consciousness is to identify the neural correlates of consciousness. So how does the brain or the cognitive system, broadly understood, generates our conscious experience? Now, the standard account of the neural correlates of conscious content or consciousness, NCC and content-NCC for short, was outlined by David Chalmers in a chapter published in Thomas Metzinger's book by MIT Press, Neural Correlates of Consciousness in 2000. I call it the standard account because since its publication, this account of the NCCs has been extremely influential, and not only among philosophers. I would say philosophers have relatively paid less attention to the problem of the NCCs, but in the science of consciousness, the neuroscience of consciousness, there has been quite a lot of discussion about of this account. So it is kind of assumed to be the standard definition and approach to the NCCs. However, there is a recent trend in the literature that shows how the standard account is, there is a growing dissatisfaction basically with the standard account. Here I just mentioned few of the most influential criticism of the standard account, from Tim Bain to Sasha Fink, more recently Howie, Joe Neisser, among the others, just to mention a few of them. And I quite second Joe Neisser's claim that if we want to make some advancements in our understanding of how the brain or the cognitive system generates conscious experience, what we need is not so much better philosophy of mind, but a better philosophy of science. And in this sense, I'm very happy to follow Joe's suggestion. This is pretty much what I'm going to do during this presentation. And now, taking up this suggestion, there has been some recent work that gestures towards a mechanistic understanding of the NCCs. Now, few examples are Bain and Howie in 2013, Joe Neisser himself, O.P. and O'Brien, and Rebonsuo. They all gesture towards this mechanistic approach. Gesture, I mean, because they still don't provide an alternative definition or account of the NCCs. So what I want to do in this presentation is to make some concrete steps towards this mechanistic approach to NCCs. And more specifically, I'm going to talk exclusively of content-NCCs, but I've also have quite a lot of things to say about the NCCs as well. Okay, now, without further ado, let me introduce the structure of this presentation. Step one, I'm going to talk about conscious visual objects perception. I narrowed down my focus to keep things within a manageable limit just to visual object perception. So I doubted whether we can extend my considerations to other sense modalities as well, like auditory perception, olfactory perception, and so on. Just narrow it down to conscious visual object perception. I'm going to clarify what are visual contents and what is conscious, what is meant with consciousness. Step two, I'm going to introduce and then criticize the standard account. And step three, I'm going to outline my mechanistic account of the neural correlates of the contents of consciousness. First, I'm going to introduce to you mechanisms and mechanistic explanation. I know that most of the attendees and panelists would already be familiar with the topic. However, some things are important to repeat again. Then I'm going to show that actually if we have a very broad look at the scientific literature, there emerges a quite different pictures of what content-NCCs are. I think that content-NCCs are not just one kind of mechanism, but actually at least three kinds of mechanisms that closely interact together. We have, I guess, at least intentional mechanisms, selection mechanisms, and perhaps consciousness mechanisms. The latter point requires some clarification. Okay, and step 4 is the conclusion. Okay, let's move on. Step 1, conscious visual object perception. I focus on a particular kind of mental state that I call states of seeing. States of seeing are mental states that are conscious visual representational character. So let me explain the terms. Representational character, just I assume like what might be called the orthodoxy in cognitive science and philosophy of mind and perception, that states of seeing have accuracy conditions. I'm non-committal regarding whether these states have veridicality conditions instead of accuracy conditions and so on. I just assume they are representational states. States of seeing present to the subject coherent units called visual objects. The literature in vision science is very clear about that. What are visual objects? Well, visual objects can be the ordinary things we see, like the table, the desk, the laptop you are seeing right now, can be another person, the famous cat on the mat, main character of so many philosophical thought experiments. It can be a building and so on and so forth. But visual objects can also be perceptually ephemeral, like waves or shadows or rainbows. The important thing is that they are coherent units made by different, that somehow comprise different properties. For example, colors, forms, and so on and so forth. Okay, now, very important, I construe the capacity of seeing objects as a complex phenomenon in the sense specified by Bogan and Woodward in their classic papers. And phenomena understood in this sense are typical explananda of our scientific efforts. Now, it won't come as a surprise that much of cognitive science is concerned with explaining how the cognitive system exercises a given capacity. This has been stressed many times, so what we want to do is to explain a capacity. How we be able to see visual objects and to see visual objects consciously? So, regarding consciousness, I'm introducing the concepts, the very basic concepts very quickly, and there is a reason for that, as it will become apparent later on in the presentation. Now, the single most important concept of consciousness is phenomenal consciousness, which refers to the qualitative character of some mental states. Peak consciousness is usually contrasted with access consciousness, or in general, functional characterizations of consciousness. Roughly stated, the content is access conscious if it is available to other cognitive modules. Here I'm using modules in a very general way, so I'm not assuming something as strong as Fodor's modularity of mind, just meaning something like specialized systems. Access consciousness has a functional character in contrast with peak consciousness, and there is a real question as to whether they are two distinct things or not. As you probably know, there is a debate whether phenomenal consciousness can be dissociated from access consciousness. That Bloch is famously the main proponent of this idea, and even ventures that maybe A and P consciousness might have two distinct neural correlates. We're going to see what does it mean for our present purposes. I also assume intentionalism, like most of the defenders of the orthodoxy, the claim that consciousness is grounded in intentional character, in the representational character. That means that basically the consciousness is somehow determined, at least in part, by content. Now, why I'm making these remarks right now? Because I think that the different ways of conceptualizing consciousness will directly bear on the way we model the content-NCC schemas. Okay, more on that in a few minutes. Okay, let's move on. The standard account. As I said, the single most influential definition of content-NCC has been put forward by David Chalmers. And this is the definition. An NCC for content is a minimal neural representational system N such that the representation of a content in N is sufficient under condition C for representation of that content in consciousness. Okay. Now, before criticizing the standard account, I want to briefly comment on a few of its aspects: condition C, correlation, and the minimally sufficient requirement. Regarding the condition C, now, it is only thanks to some specific set of conditions that such system may work. I call these, generally speaking, supporting factors. That sounds pretty obvious, right? I mean, if we talk about a given neural mechanism, obviously it is supposed to work only because it is part of a broader biological system. Christoph Koch and Geraint Rees distinguished between enabling and specific factors. Enabling factors are what he says are the tonic conditions and systems that are needed for any form of consciousness to occur at all. For example, the activity of cholinergic neurons, intralaminar nuclei within the thalamus, the basal forebrain, and so on and so forth. Of course, the list could go on and on and on. The specific factors, these are basically the NCCs and content-NCCs. Bloch also had a somewhat similar distinction between causal and constitutive factors. Regarding the causal factors, these are the set of causal conditions that must obtain oxygen supplies, glucose, and so on and so forth. The constitutive factors correspond basically to Koch's specific factors. Now, I will retain this aspect of Chalmers' definition. I won't attack this because, as I said, it is pretty obvious that a biological mechanism is supposed, or system is supposed to work under specific conditions. Let's move on to something much more controversial now. The notion of correlation is built in the very definition of the concept of NCC. So according to Chalmers, the search for such correlations can be to a large extent theoretically neutral. And he further believes that neurobiological models do not explain the correlation. As he stated in his famous book, The Conscious Mind, neurobiological approaches to consciousness can tell us something about the brain processes that are correlated with consciousness, but none of these accounts explains the correlation. From the point of view of neuroscience, the correlation is simply a brute fact. And I think this actually betrays an unjustified assumption that neuroscience cannot explain consciousness. So, at best, neurobiological models can identify correlated structures. So, neuroscience research, according to Chalmers, would target minimally sufficient neural representational systems instead. Okay, why minimally sufficient systems? Well, basically because Chalmers is, of course, aware that we should screen off the so-called neural confounds. There have been some recent work on neural prerequisite and consequent activity in neuroscience. These basically, just to put things very simply, are neural activities that react, that actually light up in close connection with the actual NCC or the target mechanism we are looking for. This prerequisite activity might be needed and therefore be something like part of the tonic condition that Cox was talking about. Or there might be consequent activity, something that immediately always reacts to the activity of our target mechanism. So how to disentangle between neural confounds and prerequisite and the target mechanism. Here is a schematic representation of the problem. So we have the target in the middle, and we have the prerequisite activity, the consequent neural activity, and parallel activities as well. I mark them with a small p's. So the point is to identify the target mechanism as the minimally sufficient system responsible for our phenomenon to occur. Okay, now, what are the problems with the standard account? There have been already some discussions about that, as I said at the outset of this presentation, but I want to focus specifically on two problems. First, the problem of distinguishing genuine NCCs from neural confounds, and secondly, explanatory role of content-NCCs. First, start with the problem of distinguishing NCCs from the neural confounds. Okay, the different neural confounds would be correlated with our event. That seems clear enough. Follows immediately from what I said. We have the prerequisite activity, we have the parallel activity, we have the consequent activity. And Chalmers, as I said, tries to solve this by isolating the right system by means of the notion of minimal sufficiency. Yet there seems to be a problem because minimally sufficient neural systems are still merely correlated with the target phenomenon. But there clearly is an asymmetry between minimally sufficient and merely correlated systems. So obviously, we want to say that the minimal sufficient system does not play the same role in generating the phenomenon than the other correlated activity. And secondly, and quite naturally follows from the former one, from a problem, if only some neural systems are minimally sufficient for generating our phenomenon, why is it so? Now, remember that for Chalmers, neurobiological theories actually merely accept the relation as a brute fact. They do not explain the phenomenon. The notion of correlation just seems to be a form of supervenience understood in this sense. It's a non-explanatory relation of covariance, and in its present formulation resembles quite closely what Jaegwon Kim called the correlation thesis. For each psychological event M, there is a physical event P such that, as a matter of law, an event of type M occurs to an organism at a time just in case an event of type P occurs to it at the same time. The phrase "as a matter of law" is put in brackets, as you see, and I now briefly explain why by turning to the second problem, the explanatory role of content-NCCs. Okay, now as I just said, one problem is to explain why the minimally sufficient systems are related to the phenomenon, even though they are still merely correlated with it. And my claim is that the standard account just cannot do justice of the explanatory goals of neuroscience research. So the problem here is that, of course, as Craver and many other philosophers today point out, of course, neuroscientists are not just looking for mere correlations. They want to explain the phenomena they are looking for. They want to identify some particular brain structures and then, so to speak, just deconstruct them, identify the component parts and operations to see how actually this system generated the phenomenon. So what sort of explanatory model underpins the standard account? Now, according to Joe Neisser, and I pretty much agree with him, according to Neisser, there would be a deductive nomological model. So this is supported by Chalmers and Metzinger understanding of the problem. There may be a form of nomological supervenience. So in that case, you can remove the brackets from the previous quotation, the Jaegwon-Kim's quotation, and add some laws of consciousness or of nature that maybe explain the phenomenon. So what we would have in this case is the following picture. So the NCCs are kind of antecedent conditions that, together with some specific laws of nature plus laws of consciousness, might enable us to deduce consciousness in the typical form of a deductive nomological model. However, this exposed the theory to some relevant problems. First, introducing laws of consciousness seems just to be a pure ad hoc move. Second, most laws in neuroscience are actually explananda, as pointed out by Robert Cummins. The standard account also exposes to all well-known problems of the nomological models of explanation, and explanatory practice of neuroscience does not seem to be deductive nomological. So, if that is the idea of scientific explanation behind the standard account, that just seems hopeless. It just is entangled with so many problems. However, if, let's say, perhaps this interpretation is wrong, then the account simply leaves open the question of the explanatory structure of content-NCC research, in which case we still don't have an explanation as for why the minimally sufficient systems are somehow so strongly related to the explanandal phenomenon. Okay, so what we want really to know, as I said, in line with the current neuroscience, is to explain consciousness and how we are able to see consciously see visual objects. And here I want to outline my alternative proposal, which is a mechanistic account of content-NCCs. Now, a substantial body of literature, as you know, suggests that much research in neuroscience and cognitive science is mechanistic. So basically, a mechanism, there are different definitions, of course, but here is a rough general definition. It's a hierarchical system of component parts, C1, C2, Cn, and their operations O1, O2, On, structured in such a way as to jointly constitute a system-level activity A, that is the explanandum phenomenon. Of course, here I'm exposing a particular kind of mechanistic explanation, which is that of constitutive mechanistic explanation. But I think it can be adjusted as well to apply it easily to other kinds of explanations as well. So within the mechanistic strategy for explanation, a prominent role play phenomenal decomposition and localization. Basically, they breaking the phenomenon into different sub-phenomena and try to localize the loci of control which are responsible for these different sub-phenomena or sub-functions within the cognitive systems. A complete mechanistic explanation ideally shows how a phenomenon is constituted by the joint interaction of component parts and their operations. So that would be the ideal, but as you know, there is a movement, so to speak, from how possibly explanations, which are sketchy explanation, it contains many gaps, and a complete explanation that shows you how actually the system works. Okay, now, is content-NCC research mechanistic? Well, implicitly, my answer is, of course, yes. Well, Francis Crick once said, while the whole might not be the simple sum of the separate parts, its behavior can, at least in principle, be understood from the nature and behavior of its parts plus the knowledge of how all these parts interact. And I think this is a very nice statement of a mechanistic strategy in NCC research. Of course, there is also a matter of terminological congruence. For example, Christoph Kocher calls the NCC the smallest set of brain mechanisms. Arwen Bachmann more recently talk about still wanted the mechanisms of consciousness, in Bachmann and Hudetz, brain mechanisms and processes that have been proposed as necessary for consciousness. As I say in the brackets, this is just a weak reason. I mean, that's not a reason for espousing a mechanistic approach. Most importantly, I think that a broad overview at the current neuroscience of consciousness shows that the ability of seeing visual objects is the result of the joint interaction of at least 3 different kinds of mechanisms. So there is an implicit assumption of a mechanistic strategy here of decomposing the phenomenon and identifying the loci of control. So explanation in psychology often proceeds by means of functional analysis or phenomenal decomposition. That won't surprise any of you. Decomposition, of course, can be realized in different ways. For example, we can, following some functional criteria, we identify, that means to say, different mental states or subcomponents of the mental state that play some particular functional role, or we might also decompose it by means of categorical or phenomenal distinction. For example, that happens all the time in philosophy of perception when we say that we see properties like colors, forms, shapes, and so on and so forth. So this is a very rough picture that shows how we might have a complex phenomenon, C, which is then distinguished into different sub-phenomena or sub-functions, C1, C2, and C3, which are then related to what I'm going to call, in short, intentional mechanisms. Okay, now visual objects are composites. They are merological units that comprise different features, such as colors, vernier offset, and so on. There are also Gestalt factors, and arguably the perennially controversial topic of binding. So there are different ways, of course, of detecting the featural and organizational aspects of visual objects. The 2 obvious ways are by means of fMRI detected variations under different tasks, manipulations such as brain injuries, non-invasive brain stimulation techniques such as the TMS, and so on and so forth. So these are just different ways of detecting different component parts, features that make up visual objects. The important thing is that don't try this at home with your little brother. And there is considerable evidence that the visual system can be decomposed as to identify a number of operations that are then related to specific brain structures. Now, of course, this does not suppose the locality assumption, the claim, something like the strong modularity thesis. There is evidence, as pointed out by Martha Farah in a classic paper published on BBS, that the cortical specialized areas are highly interactive. Now, let me introduce to you the definition of intentional mechanism. An intentional mechanism is a hierarchical system of component parts, C1, C2, Cn, and their operations structured in such a way as to jointly constitute, under condition C, the accuracy conditions or contents relative to visual objects or its subcomponents. So C1, so for example, colors, forms, and so on and so forth. There are different kinds of intentional mechanisms. Let's move on to selection mechanisms. Now, we're interested in conscious content, not just content per se. Now, taking up Jacob Howe's suggestion, much of current content-NCC research targets selection mechanisms. So what are the selection mechanisms? Let us take paradigmatic cases of studies in content-NCC research like binocular rivalry, attentional paradigms, sensory extinction, various forms of neglect and masking. One trouble for Chalmers' account pointed out by Tim Bain and Jacob Howe later is that and John Searle as well, one problem in content-NCC research is obviously that the subject is assumed to be conscious. So when we are looking for neural correlates of consciousness in an already conscious subject at the presence of an invariant stimulus, just trying to detect, in the case of binocular rivalry, which stimulus gains dominance and therefore becomes conscious, we're not really targeting the neural correlates of consciousness per se, but, as Jacob Howe suggests, selection mechanisms, mechanisms that actually select which content have to become conscious. Okay, so a definition of selection mechanisms might be the following one: a hierarchical system of component parts and their operations structured in such a way as to jointly constitute, under condition C, the phenomenon of selecting a set of contents for consciousness. Okay, so we have intentional mechanisms, probably many of them. We have selection mechanisms, again, it's an empirical question to assess how many of them there have to be. There has to be there in the brain or the neural system. But what about consciousness? Well, it is not clear, let me say from the outset, whether there is a single mechanism responsible for consciousness, Pache, Daniel Dennett, or whether consciousness is just a cluster concept under which we lump together different phenomena. The important thing I want to highlight now is that by having this broad overview of the literature and the neuroscience of consciousness, we can identify the following very general mechanistic schema. The schema runs as follows. So we have intentional mechanisms on the one hand, we have selection mechanisms on the other hand, and then we have putatively conscious mechanisms. So that should be assessed by specific research. Okay, so what is a mechanistic schema in this case? Well, it's a truncated abstract description of a mechanism that can be filled with more specific descriptions of component entities and activities. So this is the quotation from Lindsay Dodden. And another popular example of mechanistic schema that might be used to guide research is Watson's central dogma of molecular biology. So we have DNA, RNA, and protein. As it stands, of course, this is a very general account, of mechanistic account of what is going on in the case of conscious visual object perception. But the mechanistic schema is not supposed to explain directly the phenomenon, but just to provide a kind of template within which to put and let us converge all the different studies about conscious visual object perception. Now, as I promised, the concept of consciousness is quite fuzzy, and there are different ways, of course, of characterizing consciousness. So, and my suggestion is that we can model or remodel, better said, the abstract mechanistic schema just introduced in different ways according to the different ways of conceptualizing consciousness. For example, if you suppose strong intentionalism, that is to say, you claim that the only way, that the better account of consciousness is just in terms of functional characterization. Let's say something like Michael Tye's panic account. So phenomenal consciousness just is a particular kind of content which is poised for abstract, it's just abstract and poised for the control of other mechanisms like language mechanisms, memory mechanisms, thought mechanisms, and so on. In this case, our abstract schema could be adjusted in the following way. As you can see, selection mechanism detects particular contents and make them available to other cognitive mechanisms. If one were to suppose NetBlock's distinction between access and phenomenal consciousness, then probably we would have a twofold distinction. The selection mechanism would then pass on the information, the selected content, to a mechanism for phenomenal consciousness and another one for access consciousness. So I want to stress once again, because this has generated confusion in the past when I was presenting this work, that I'm not exposing a formal Cartesian theater. I'm just trying to leave out as a kind of thing that has to be determined by further research how to better characterize consciousness in this case. But the point I'm making is also that the abstract schema that I put forward can be readjusted easily to accommodate different intuitions about the very nature of consciousness. Now, before I conclude, let me just mention that I would like to thank different people. There are, of course, many aspects of my full paper that are were not in the when I was not able to put them in the presentation for reasons of time, but I'm happy to answer to your questions, and maybe these issues will raise up during the Q&A session. I would like to thank you all for listening to me, and here I am for your question. Thank you.